一間咁樣嘅地方。OK， 我哋係咪可以開始
？Starting.
OK, I think we
3
can
minutes.
start now.
3 minutes?
Yeah, we will start by Hong Hou Feng, who has a videotaped message for us because it's now midnight, 2 o'clock there, so it's quite impossible for him to appear at this moment. So he recorded a message for us. And then we will go by the order of the day, and each of you will do a presentation or sharing for 20 minutes, and then we will introduce you one by one, okay, to our Facebook group, okay. A lot of the other people attending this conference will be following our Facebook Live. Okay, so you will be, I think, Neil and Kuruto-san and Professor Zhang and Philip. Philip will come in a little bit later because again it's midnight there in the UK, and by the time around 3-4, I think you'll be about 6 in the UK in the morning. So he will wake up in time for the sharing. So it's the problem of global research, okay, but we are getting very used to it. Okay, so we will start by having a sharing by Professor Hong Hou Feng, who is of course one of our own longtime friends and dating from our time at Chinese University. He is now the Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Weisenfeld Professor in Political Economy in the Cricket School of Arts and Sciences, and also in the School of Advanced International Studies and Johns Hopkins University. Of course, he had undergraduate training at Chinese U at a time when Tai Lok and I were both there, and so we date a long way back. He has, of course, has a variety of research interests. Global political economy, protests, nation state formations, and with a focus on China and East Asia. He has written quite a number of books, award-winning some of them, and his articles appeared in American Journal of Sociology, American Sociological Review, and also other very prominent venues. He received his PhD in sociology from the Johns Hopkins University and taught once at Chinese University of Hong Kong and Indiana University of Bloomington before moving to Johns Hopkins. So we will now have a sharing of by Professor Hong, and then that will kickstart our discussion today. Okay.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you. Because of the time difference, I can't be here in real time, so I do this recording. I'm going to talk about the state of Hong Kong studies in the United States, though actually I don't have a lot to talk about because compared to other places like Canada and UK and many other places, and Hong Kong studies is relatively less developed as a field in the US, and also compared to other areas considered as part of the Greater China region, for example, Taiwan studies and Tibet studies, and Hong Kong study is relatively underdeveloped, and I would like to share my thoughts about why it is underdeveloped, and in comparative fashion, and to compare with, for example, Taiwan studies and Tibetan studies, and to see what can be done to enhance the presence and of this or promote these Hong Kong studies as a field in the United States. First of all, I would like to do a little bit of overview on the works done by US-based scholars that is related to Hong Kong, and some of you must be familiar with some of them, but probably some of them are less well known in Hong Kong, but they're also important works. So let me share my screen. Give me a second. Okay. So, of course, that U.S. Institutions, university has have produced a lot of PhD, for example, that cover Hong Kong topics, and but many of the students who work on Hong Kong in their dissertation might not necessarily end up based in the U.S. after their graduation. Many of them, of course, went back to Hong Kong and went to Europe and many other places. So here I'm focusing on the works done by U.S.-based scholars. So it's a more narrowly defined uh, um, um, kind of set of scholars and works. Um, and in political science, for example, you have James Shen in NYU, who edited books on Hong Kong, the super paradox, and life after return to China. Gary Hamilton is somebody that I'm sure that many of you here are familiar with. So he edited a book and also write a number of articles and chapters about global commodity chain with a focus on Hong Kong industrialism early on. So in 1999, obviously the timing is that it's a conference in night of Hong Kong sovereignty handover. So he edited a book out of the conference called Cosmopolitan Capitalist Hong Kong and the Chinese Diaspora at the end of the 20th century. So both James Sen and Gary Hamilton, a lot, in particular Hong Kong studies scholar per se, but for example, James Sen has been working on U.S.-Asia policy, U.S.-China relation, and it just happened that with the chance of Hong Kong sovereignty handover, and he did a conference and edited a book about Hong Kong, and so is Gary Hamilton. His latest book is with Gao Chengsu, is about Taiwan industrialism and manufacturing and upgrading, actually. And so though in early times, and he also worked on Hong Kong economic sociology. Chai Zhongfang is historian that his work is translated in Hong Kong. Definitely, you must be very familiar with his work about Hong Kong in Chinese history, community and social unrest in British colony, 1842 to 1913. David Meyer, Hong Kong as a global metropolis, basically is an overview of Hong Kong financial centers role as also Hong Kong role as a global cities. And also David Meyer, he's a sociologist in Brown University. I think he retired, of course, and his main field is not Hong Kong, and his most other significant work as a sociology actually is focused on industrial upgrading in 19th century America. So he's a kind of economic sociologist studying the U.S. and it happened that he has some Hong Kong interest and connection and wrote that book in 2000. Also in light of just the sovereignty handover in 1997. So there's a wave of Hong Kong works right after 1997, and definitely that Jeff Wasserstrom you must be very familiar with, and his latest book is Visual Hong Kong on the Brain. Is basically about umbrella and touch upon some of the issues related to the 2019 unrest as well. It's a very timely book again, and Jeff Wasserstrom is a 20th century China historian. His main research is about May 4th movement and student movement throughout Chinese history in the 20th century. So he basically worked on Hong Kong unrest and from that framework. And again, it is that he's not particularly focused on Hong Kong, and he has a co-author kind of on that work. And it's just things happen like umbrella, and then the 2019 protests, and then he happened to be in Hong Kong and have some Hong Kong collection. So he did some research on the unrest and then write something about it. And in the think tank, well, you have Richard Bush, definitely. Then he published this book by the Brookings Institutions, Hong Kong in the Shadow of China, Living with the Leviathan. Basically, it is a book about the umbrella and the question of universal suffrage and the democratic movement in Hong Kong. And again, that he's not a Hong Kong study scholar, and he used to be with the AIT in Taiwan, American Taiwan. And he has been a kind of a U.S. Taiwan, U.S. China relations scholars. And after he done with his official capacity, and he became a scholar and wrote a number of books on Taiwan and U.S. Taiwan China relation. And again, that things happen. That is the umbrella. And in the think tank world, that people were scrambling to find people who can write and work on it. And then he took up the task and write a book about Hong Kong. So the pattern is that of course this list is not by no way exhaustive, and there are a lot of scholars who are also U.S. based and also partially Hong Kong based that you must be very familiar with. For example, Alvin So, that's written significant work on democratization in Hong Kong as a book and also as an article in Journal of Asian Studies and many other places. Though when he wrote those works, I think he's already in Hong Kong, and another of our colleagues, mentors, and teachers, of course, Ching Kun Lee, who is not excited Hong Kong studies scholar, and most, and if not all of her works, of course, is mostly about labor in China and global China in Africa, and recently, of course, then she and many of our colleagues in Hong Kong collaborate on that book project on the umbrella, starting to work on Hong Kong, and again, that she's basically primarily a Hong Kong studies scholar, but things happen that draw these scholars' energies to study Hong Kong, and in the kind of as a side dish, I would say that so it is the quite a common pattern that many of these scholars not quite primarily working on Hong Kong and working on China, Taiwan, and other issues, or Asia Pacific in general, but things happen, so they somehow have some connection and some knowledge about Hong Kong, and write something about Hong Kong. And there's some folks who are more primarily working on Hong Kong, but end up not being in the U.S., so I don't include those people. For example, Peter Hamilton, who is a historian, got a PhD in University of Texas, Austin, who worked on a very interesting dissertation. Now it's becoming a book published by Columbia University Press called Make in Hong Kong. It's Trans-Pacific Diasporic Network, to talk about Hong Kong in the 1970s and how these Trans-Pacific networks, diasporic network, and concentrate in Hong Kong and connecting East and West, and China at that time is not very open, and also the US and Europe, and then create a kind of a capitalism, and Chinese capitalism that later became very prominent in the 80s. And afterward, he graduated in Texas, and then he did a 1 or 2 years in postdoc in Colombia, and now he's teaching in Ireland, I think. So he didn't end up in the U.S. at the moment, so I don't include his works. But there are some people who primarily work on Hong Kong, but not based in the U.S., though they are products of U.S. Institutions and PhD. And in the think tank world, that Richard Bush is one example. Another example is actually, let me stop here. And share another screen. That is this think tank also, think tank scholar also has shared this pattern. That is, there are many people who work on China, work on Taiwan, but things happen in Hong Kong, so they scramble to put together some Hong Kong related project. One example that can show my point is this project by the think tank, DC think tank CSIS, which is a very important think tank in terms of influencing policy. Where is it? Give me a second. Here it is. So the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and they are consistently ranked as the most important think tank in the U.S. and the most important defense security issue related think tank in the world, and it is very influential. For example, the upcoming State Department, Secretary of State of the Biden administration, and Anthony Blinken actually came from this think tank as as a policy researcher and scholars, and later took up a political career. So it is a very important think tank, and there's a lot of scholars there with PhD and moved from university job to this job. So, for example, my former colleagues and Scott Kennedy in Indiana University, now it is running the Chinese economy and business program there. So there's a lot of these scholars in these think tanks, but none of them are specialized in Hong Kong. But when things happen, they scrambled people and put together efforts to put together this project. Sometimes it's podcasts like this one, Hong Kong on the Brink, that was launched in 2019 as a series of talk and interviews about the situation of Hong Kong. But you look at the list of people actually on this podcast project, you know, there's the situation. First of all, the podcast is run by Judd Blanchard, and he is primarily a Chinese scholar. His book just out last year is a very interesting book about the intellectual politics of the new left in China, on the run-up to China accession to the WTO, and how this the new red guard, so-called, influenced Chinese policy and influenced the Xi Jinping era. So he is primarily a China in politics and China intellectual politics scholars. And look at the podcast and look at the people who they find to talk about Hong Kong. You can see the pattern. Of course, there's some not only scholar. For example, the first episode is with Ambassador Kurt Tong, who is you must be very familiar with because he is the former general counsel of the U.S. in Hong Kong consulate, and then Bonnie Gazer is another CSIS person who worked on basically Taiwan and China, and then to talk about Hong Kong from a Taiwan perspective. And then some usual suspect, of course, there's a political scientist, Victoria Hui, that I'm sure many of you know. And Ben Bland is a think tank scholar from Australia. Also, he's not a Hong Kong studies scholar, but study basically U.S.-China relation and Chinese politics. And then, of course, Levin Nord, Dennis Ho, Josiah Wong, Jeffrey Ong, and Brian Leung, when they are in D.C. to attend the Congress testimony on the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. And so they got them there to talk about it, and myself and another usual suspect, and specialists on Hong Kong, on Chinese armed police force, and also specialists on no, that is not by somebody. It is the organizer podcast, Judd and Andrew themselves talking with each other, and then Min Sin Pei, another very familiar name, who work on domestic policy in China. So you look at the lineup of this Hong Kong project, you know, also even in the think tank world, it is the same pattern, that there's not many Hong Kong specialists or people who primarily working on Hong Kong as a field. They work on Taiwan or work on China, but things happen, and then so they need to put together efforts and people to put together these programs and events to cover Hong Kong. So it is a kind of a reflection of the poverty of the field of Hong Kong study in the U.S. So they just couldn't quite find people who actually specialize in Hong Kong. So they need to find these people who somehow know a little bit about Hong Kong, even though their main line of research is not Hong Kong, most of them. And comparatively speaking, it's very different if you look at other adjacent studies. Let me share this PowerPoint screen again. That is, you compare with the Taiwan studies, you know that the Hong Kong studies, even though you have these scholars here and there, occasionally writing on Hong Kong in the U.S., but at the same time, there's also the lack of institutionalization. If you are compared with Taiwan studies, in Taiwan studies, a lot of major, first of all, they have the association. There's a lot of American Taiwan Studies Association. The background is, of course, interesting. It's started by a group of Taiwan background PhD graduate students in social science and humanities studying in the U.S. And some young scholars with Taiwan background as well, that they formed this association in the mid-1990s in the U.S. to have this annual conference. And they still have this annual conference, and sometimes invite scholars from Taiwan, and sometimes invite scholars in the U.S. who work on Taiwan to talk about all these kind of, from literature to politics to social stratification, social mobility in Taiwan, and to promote Taiwan studies in the U.S. So they have these institutions, they have this association, and also in many universities, many of them are major universities, they have this separate Taiwan Study Center programs or initiatives. And as you know that in the US, these area studies are clustered in, for example, East Asian studies and Asian studies and these kind of centers. And usually people who work on Taiwan or any area in China and so on and so forth, probably one or two scholars in the school, and they are affiliated with that East Asian study centers, or sometimes it is under China study centers. But there are some schools in which they have separate Taiwan study center and programs and initiative, and University of Washington, UCLA, Harvard, UC Santa Barbara, and Berkeley, and also some think tanks organization has this Taiwan section as well, and they even now have a Global Taiwan Institute in DC, which is a think tank organization dedicated to Taiwan. And to compare to Hong Kong studies, of course, that the big difference is that Taiwan studies get the financial resources to pull these things off. First of all, they are scholars and who historically and also contemporarily build their career mainly or even solely on the study of Taiwan. One primary example of Shelley Rieger, and who is the go-to person when you want to know more about Taiwan in North American Conference, and if there's election, that she is called upon to comment on things, and she wrote a lot of important books and articles about Taiwan democratization, all aspects of Taiwan. And also, of course, that you have scholars like Thomas Goh in Berkeley, who started his career by studying Taiwan, dependent development, and later democratization, civil society, and later on, of course, and he also worked on mainland China as well. But he still maintained his interest in Taiwan. So in Taiwan study, you really have scholars who build a career primarily on Taiwan studies, and at the same time that you can, besides this kind of more number of people who primarily work on Taiwan, and other factors that these Taiwan studies compared to Hong Kong studies, and it's much more institutionalized. Of course, they have the financial resources, and many of these Taiwan study centers and programs and initiatives in the US, and I think it is similar in UK and Europe, is that they are not totally financed by the whole university. They got the support from, for example, the Ministry of Education in Taiwan, then sometimes Jiang Qing Foundation, and all these financial sources in Taiwan, from Taiwan. It's just like Korean studies and Japan studies, and Korean Foundation and Japan Foundation fund a lot of these centers, and sometimes they even have a chair professor in Korean studies in Japan study in these universities. So this financial resources from their home countries is very important in supporting this initiative and study centers and programs. And the same about the North American Taiwan Studies Association. I'm not quite sure in the beginning how they pull it off, but right now, for example, you can just go to the web page. Let me share that you look at the funding structures of this annual conference of the North America Taiwan Studies Conference. You know that is really very different in comparison to the situation in Hong Kong. That is, for example, it is the latest conference. So every year when they have conference, they look for a sponsor. And for example, in the 2020 conference, there's a list of sponsors. So they are the usual suspect: and Jiang Qing Foundation, Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, which is kind of a foundation set up in the parliament in Taiwan, and to support democracy-related, democratization-related research, not only about Taiwan, but also mainland China and other places as well. And the Institute of Sociology of Academia Sinica and other, also the Taiwan History Institute of Academia Sinica and Ethnology Institute of the Sinica and some U.S. sponsors, but mostly that I don't know, does it have any meaning with the size of the logo? And I'm not sure whether the bigger the size of the logo, the more money that they give. I'm not sure, but you can see that they are well funded by this financial source from Taiwan, and so that obviously Hong Kong didn't have that, and not yet at least. That in North America, if you want to have a Hong Kong studies program and initiative in your universities, or have some kind of Hong Kong conferences, that definitely that you need to have resources. And given that the Hong Kong diaspora is not a huge presence there, that so it's not like in Middle East study, in Israel studies, then there's a huge Jewish diaspora and Jewish population and entrepreneurs in the US that would finance these programs and finance these activities. In Hong Kong, that you cannot quite count on the Hong Kong diaspora in the US, and just given the current situation of Hong Kong, that I'm not sure whether it's realistic to expect that any of these kind of institutions or activities can be found resources from Hong Kong. That and of course that it is not that Hong Kong doesn't have any Hong Kong originated, Hong Kong funded organization related to research and scholarly activities in the US, but it's not the kind that we are thinking about. For example, that Hong Kong even has a think tank in the US, in this area, run and by our old friend Mr. Patrick Ho Ji Ping. It is the CEFC. That there's a think tank that's very well known now, of course, that is funded by Hong Kong resources and founded in DC. But it's not about Hong Kong. It's about US-China relation mostly, and now it is folded already, so we don't need to talk about it. And so that is the situation. That the lack of financial resources definitely is a kind of a constraint, and also the lack of scholar who are really, I might miss somebody but overall that most people who write about Hong Kong, who work on Hong Kong, and they're not primarily Hong Kong study scholars, and again that is also even very different from Tibetan studies, and in the US actually Tibetan studies in universities are bigger than even Taiwan studies. It didn't quite require donation from, for example, the Tibetan diaspora and Dharamsala and things like that. And even though they do have some kind of resources, like for example, recently I'm not sure which university, maybe UC San Diego, or maybe I forgot which university they found. It's like a Dalai Lama professorship with obvious funding sources, but even without that a lot of universities managed to build this Tibetan studies program because of the Buddhism thing, the spirituality thing. So it is high demand among the students. If you open a course about Tibetan Buddhism and all these Buddhist texts and language, and there are a lot of students who are interested in taking this. And of course, that is not very difficult to find donor, because there's a lot of practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism among the rich people, celebrities in the US, and not necessarily related to politics, but they usually frame it as kind of a religious studies and language studies. And so Tibetan studies is also big, and so Hong Kong studies is really incomparable, but of course it is changing now that I expect that more people will be interested in focusing their research on Hong Kong because of what things that happen. But then it leads to another issue about from what perspective you look at Hong Kong, in a comparative perspective, as a kind of a part of the Chinese studies perspective, or compared with Taiwan, or compared with other former British colony, and so on and so forth. So it is an intellectual issues that I'm sure that what we can't deal with here with this time constraint. And also we have this Hong Kong Society for Hong Kong Studies in Hong Kong now, which is participating in the Association for Asian Studies, sponsoring panels, and it is a good start. And they have their own reception in AAS these days, and so it's very good start. And for the unfortunate reason that Hong Kong is on the spotlight in the US and people are more aware of the situation in Hong Kong, more interest in Hong Kong. So I expect that the interest in terms of studies and research on Hong Kong will increase, and more scholars who build their career on Hong Kong will start to emerge and increase in numbers. And at the same time that when interest increase and financial constraint, the situation might also change, and I optimistically I can expect the more interest in funding this kind of program from different quarters in the U.S. societies or from Hong Kong society in different sectors, and if for example at least some film studies and art and culture thing that I'm not sure why. Maybe there's some already that I don't know, but I'm not aware of there's any. For example, these Hong Kong Film Study Centers in the U.S. Maybe there's some not in the U.S. or maybe there's some in U.S. that I'm not aware of. But at least this kind of thing that it is less sensitive politically. Maybe that at least this kind of thing might can be a kind of a start to look for funding sources from people from within Hong Kong to finance and fund this kind of initiative as a kind of academic field or initiative or program or studies. So that is the state of the Hong Kong studies in the U.S. that I'm sorry that I don't have much to talk about because it is not a very developed field and it is just starting, and I look forward it is continuous growth, and definitely we have a lot to learn from, for example, from the development of Taiwan studies and things like that in the U.S. And of course that in terms of resources and commitment from the home society, it is incomparable, but still that there's a lot of things that we can learn from them, and there's a lot of room for future development. So thank you for your attention. Sorry that I can't be here in person and also in real time, but I look forward to future opportunities to exchange with you and continue the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, we say thank you to Professor Hong for his interesting introduction, overview of Hong Kong studies in the USA and fascinating comparison with Taiwan studies and the kind of institutional underpinning and of course communal support for the particular research area. Our next on the line is Leo, who is with us now. Can you hear me, Leo? It's okay?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. 11:30 your time?
No, 10:30.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we welcome also our next speaker, Dr. Neil Sin, Associate Professor of History and Asian Studies, as well as the convener of the Hong Kong Studies Initiative at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. Hong Fong was talking about the lack of an institutional base of Hong Kong studies in the academia in the USA, and we are very fortunate to have one such base of development of Hong Kong studies at UBC, initiated by Neil, among others, to carry this forward. Of course, he's naturally interested in Hong Kong studies, born and raised in Hong Kong, and worked briefly in Hong Kong as well, I think, as a reporter. Although his primary area is imperial Chinese history, but his interest on identities, the formation and development of identities, Chinese and Hong Kong, ignited his interest and on Hong Kong study, especially on recent history. Okay, and so that of course sparked the development of the Hong Kong Studies Initiative at UBC, and we are looking forward to another very fascinating overview of what is happening in Canada and elsewhere on Hong Kong studies from Neil's perspective. The time is yours. We have 30 minutes for each of our speakers.
Okay.
Please.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and other organizers from the Academy of Hong Kong Studies for putting together this annual conference. I particularly appreciate your efforts to bring together scholars from different parts of the world and from different disciplines, in this case, at least onto the same screen. And it is interesting to hear what Ho Fung has to say, because of course, we think about, of course, he never mentioned Canada, right? so even though Canada and the US are very close, we're right next to each other, and we do share a lot of similarities in terms of academic culture and history. But based on what he said, right? So it's just hearing what he said, I can already identify some differences, and I think numbers do matter, right? The fact that in Canada we do have a large number of residents, citizens originally from Hong Kong. We are hundreds of thousands, concentrating in the metropolitan areas in Vancouver and Toronto. I think that matter and that make a huge difference between what is happening in Canada and what is happening in the US in terms of the development of Hong Kong studies. So I think it also reminds me, what Ho Fung said also reminds me that it's all the more important for us in Canada to take advantage. I don't mean it in a negative way, but to take advantage of that, of the presence of people who care about Hong Kong and who are from Hong Kong to help develop the field of Hong Kong studies. I think that's actually one thing I learned today, right? So that's. I also want to. So before I start, I also want to say a few other things. So first of all, I want to congratulate the paper awardees from yesterday. I actually listened to some of the talks. I didn't listen to all the talks, but I was impressed by the range of topics and also the diversity of approaches. So well done. Congratulations. Let me start with caveats, though. First, the comments that I am going to make are primarily drawn from my observations of the academia. I understand, especially in Hong Kong, there are non-government, non-university affiliated organizations or groups that are doing very interesting and important work that could and should be considered under the umbrella of Hong Kong studies. I have an inkling that such phenomena can also be found outside of Hong Kong, but I won't be commenting on such efforts because I don't know much about. But what I would say is that I would certainly encourage collaborations, especially across geographic boundaries. Right? So that's important to know. Hong Kong studies are not limited to what we do in universities. Second, the second caveat is that it's not my intention, and I'm not going to do what Ho Fung did. I'm not going to offer a survey of Hong Kong-related research in Canadian universities. In some ways, too big a job to be done unpaid. Now, this is, of course, when I check whether my audience is awake, since I'm speaking into the void, really. I would just ask that, even if you're taking a break, do come back for the next speaker. Anyway, joking aside, I'm not going to do a survey because I think I missed some and I'm going to feel bad. But instead, what I'll offer as examples, the University of Toronto and also the University of British Columbia, my home institution, as examples of what have been done and what can be done. And I will conclude by pointing out some of the challenges as well as possibilities associated with engaging in Hong Kong studies in Canada. Let me first make a few general observations. First, for better or for worse, all eyes are now on Hong Kong. Second, despite the challenges facing the humanities and social sciences and the academia more generally, for a range of reasons, there is a new sense of commitment, at least I feel it that way, there's a new sense of commitment, especially among the younger generation, to understanding Hong Kong and to placing that understanding into meaningful use. Third, it is the confluence of these two related trends, that is, all eyes are now on Hong Kong, and that there is a enthusiasm and energy among the younger generation to study Hong Kong. The confluence of these two trends that makes this moment a particularly important juncture for encouraging the study of Hong Kong, both by those living in Hong Kong and also scholars beyond. So this is why what the Academy is doing and what the Society of Hong Kong Studies is doing and what the Hong Kong Studies Journal is doing are so important. Together, you are creating an environment, an infrastructure to make Hong Kong studies, maybe I shouldn't say possible. I mean, without an infrastructure, I think it is possible, but to make it more possible. Right? So I think it is very important for the work you do. Okay, fourth, and last general observation. At this particular juncture, insofar as the study of Hong Kong is concerned, we need to do what we can to fire up all the furnaces and let the 100 flowers bloom. I've been here reminding myself that this is an absolutely horrendous sentence. Mixing metaphors and using mouse language. But I hope it does convey my point, that we need to be inclusive and we need to build a big tent for the study of Hong Kong. So now let me turn to the particular context of Canada. I am trying to share the screen. Here we go. I was trying to say that anyway. I won't go there. So so let me just hold on one second. So as I mentioned, this is not intended as an exhaustive survey of all Hong Kong related research that's been carried out in Canadian universities. However, I do want to report that using Hong Kong as keywords, one could locate on the website of Thesis Canada, which is part of the Library and Archives Canada, at least 263 MA theses or master's theses and doctoral dissertations, of which the earliest one is dated to 1957. Now, of course, this is by no means exhaustive. From what I can tell, the database started in 1965 when they began to collect materials, and I know for a fact, because I was doing some checking this afternoon, just some random checking theses that I know should be there, but they are not there. So this is by no means exhaustive, but just to give a sense of the number. So the number, of course, is only an approximation, and that is likely to be much higher. Still, it's interesting to note that the subjects of research, at least as indicated by the thesis title, do cover a wide range of disciplines: anthropology, architecture, business, cinema, communication, economics, education, geography, health, history, law, media studies, politics, social work, sociology, urban planning, etc. Right? So it's basically a wide range of from humanities and social sciences. Now, of course, I was also struck by what Ho Fung said, because he mentioned it almost every other sentence. Someone wrote a book on Hong Kong, but he or she's not really a Hong Kong specialist. Right? That seems to be the nature of things. I think that's generally true in North America, partly because Hong Kong studies is such a new field, and so it's, I think if I have looked into any of these dissertations and theses, my suspicion, at least for most of it, they were supervised by supervisors who are not specialists in Hong Kong, right? I think that's a fair guess. So in any case, I thought I should do some homework and report back on the thesis. And so one final point about this is, I'm suspecting that as we go forward, there will be a mini explosion in terms of both the number of theses produced and the range of subject matters. So I think my sense is that there's a great interest in Hong Kong, and therefore there are more graduate students who would include Hong Kong as part of their study. So now, let me turn my focus to the two institutions. And I think, again, this is another contrast between what Ho-Fung reported for the US and for us here in Canada, that we could speak of some institutional developments and support. So let me first speak about the Richard Charles Lee Canada Hong Kong Library. Now, of course, I really have let my colleague in Toronto to speak on his behalf. But since they are not here, I will do what I can, hopefully without misrepresenting them. So the Richard Charles Lee Canada Hong Kong Library was founded or established in 2007 at the University of Toronto, and it was named after Richard Charles Lee, right? Lee means of Lee's Theatres fame, the Lee family, and the library was very much a labor of love of Vivian Poi, who is a daughter of Richard Charles Lee, who was the first senator of Asian descent in the Senate of Canada. And of course, Vivian Poi grew up in Hong Kong and was one of the examples of Hong Kong immigrants, right? Immigrants from Hong Kong come to Canada, very much part of the Canadian society, and become, in fact, one of the leaders in Canadian society. And so this is the Richard Charles Lee Library in some way is, in many ways, a good example of the kind of connections between Hong Kong and Canada and what that connections can do for Hong Kong and Hong Kong studies. So the Richard Charles Lee Canada Hong Kong Library is the largest research library collection for Hong Kong studies and Hong Kong Canadian studies outside of Hong Kong. Right? It has, you can go and look at the information yourself. Let me see. So here, it has some information about its collection, 71,000 volumes, of newspapers, collections. For those of us who are in Canada, what is also interesting is the collection of Chinese newspapers published by the Chinese communities in Canada, right? So they also have a good collection. And on top of that, they have been getting a lot of private collections by immigrants from Hong Kong, because the library is seen as a highly respectable depository of materials. And so this is a range of their collections. They have, for example, a Hong Kong politics archive where they, as I understand it, they have archived some of the materials related to the umbrella movement. And they have the Carl Smith collection. They have a Hong Kong Hanover collection. So this is really a treasure trove for Hong Kong studies in Canada. And from time to time, I was wondering how we can steal it from Toronto to bring it to UBC. But I don't think we can. So I think it's okay. And in some way, I think it is a good idea to have multiple centers and multiple places where people can access Hong Kong related materials. So I would say if you have not visited the library, or either online or in person, I would encourage you to do so. Next time when you come to visit allowed to travel, next time when you come to visit your family or relatives in Toronto, do drop by. And it is a public library, it's open to anyone. It's also useful to mention, in fact, very important to mention, the connection between the Richard Charles Lee Library and Bernard Luke, right? the late Bernard Luke, of course, a good friend, and also obviously for the Education University, Bernard Luke was a VP academic back in the days, right? So Bernard came to Toronto in 1990, and he and Diana, my dear colleague, Professor Diana Larry, together they started a Canada-Hong Kong project in 1990. And I think that was in part a result of the interest on Hong Kong during the waves of migration in the 1980s and the 1990s. So they started the Canada-Hong Kong project, which turned into a Canada-Hong Kong Resource Center, which evolved into the Richard Charles Lee Library. So that's another important connection as well. Okay, so let me move on to talk about the Hong Kong Studies Initiative at UBC. So the Hong Kong Studies Initiative at UBC was fully established in the spring of 2017. And I think we can, again, as historians, we're always very mindful how we reconstruct the past, right? So every time I tell the story, it's somehow something is different. So let me try to stick with the script. I think there are two factors leading to the establishment of the Hong Kong Studies Initiative. One has to do with the fact that for a long time, before 2016 or even 2015, my colleagues at UBC had been interested in building a Cantonese language program, in part because of the demographics of Canada and Vancouver in particular, because of our student body, our connections with Hong Kong, and also because the Department of Asian Studies at UBC is very committed to teaching all kinds of languages. So we offer courses on Tibetan. We offer courses on, of course, many of the South Asian languages. We are starting to offer Persian. So our scope of Asian studies expands. So it seems all too natural for us to also want to teach Cantonese as well. And we were very fortunate that we received a donation by two brothers, Mr. Alex Watt and Mr. Chisham Watt. Both of them also were immigrants from Hong Kong. And it was a donation that allowed us to establish the Cantonese language program. So that is the impetus, and that allows us to think bigger. So once we start teaching language, what else can we do, right? So that focusing on Hong Kong becomes again all too natural. And I guess another impetus is not too surprising. It was after the umbrella movement that, again, this energy or this desire to do something more about Hong Kong or for Hong Kong or the study of Hong Kong was in the mind of many of my colleagues. And so again, it becomes another reason to launch an initiative. So what we have been doing is we are interested in offering courses for undergraduates. So we can see here, we offer language courses, cinema courses, history courses, courses on migration. We also have had a new course on Cantonese music. We had a course on Hong Kong literature. We hope to offer it soon in the future again. We are doing what we can. Of course, there are gaps. There are gaps that we hope to fill, but in time, hopefully, we will. But this is the starting point. So teaching, providing courses, and I'm happy to report that all our Hong Kong related courses have been very well received and well subscribed by students originally from Hong Kong, or maybe they were second generation, third generation, but also students from mainland China, and also students from many other parts of the world as well. So maybe I'll pause for a moment. Stephen, do I have 5 minutes or 10 minutes or? I can't hear you, but I assume I have 5. Okay, so let me continue. We also, of course, sorry.
10 more minutes.
Oh, thank you, Hello. And so we offer teaching, but we also, of course, do other things as well. We also try to engage the community by and Dialogue and Stephen they were both in Vancouver before, and bringing speakers in and talking to the community when, of course, this is pre-COVID time, and of course because Vancouver has such a large Hong Kong community and Chinese community, there's always a strong demand and desire for speakers who can speak beyond the academic language to talk about Hong Kong and to talk about, again, could be politics, but it could also be about literature and popular culture. And there's a strong interest in Vancouver. We also bring in speakers nowadays. We of course bring in speakers online. We have organized a number of series. We started off with a series called City Inscribed, that is to help launch our course on Hong Kong literature. We brought in many speakers. Dong Kai Zhang came, and also many other scholars came to help us launch the course. Last year, we organized a series on City in Protest, again, inviting speakers to talk about what was happening in Hong Kong. This year, we are doing a series on City Archived, which is to talk about how the city is cataloged, archived, remembered. So we are bringing speakers to talk about different kinds of archives, not necessarily sort of the old musty libraries archives, but all kinds of archives. We had a speaker from the Polytechnic University of Hong Kong, Professor Brian Kwok, who gave a talk on the neon lights. That was wonderful. So these are things that we have been doing. Of course, we also encourage research. We are in the process of finishing an oral history project on the umbrella movement. We interviewed people who have Hong Kong connection and Canadian connections to talk about what they thought about the umbrella movement, how they experienced it. We also organize a history workshop. We brought in especially younger scholars to talk about their new projects. So we try to encourage not only established colleagues to work on Hong Kong projects, but also younger scholars to work on Hong Kong projects. Finally, I just want to mention in terms of our Hong Kong Studies Initiative is that we are very excited that we are actually we are in the process of recruiting a chair person for Hong Kong Studies. So it's very exciting. And this is Canada Research Chair is a big deal. And it is very much our hope that this would become our sort of a key person to help develop Hong Kong Studies at UBC, but also in Canada and perhaps globally. So this is a big deal. So let me end. So I have a few more thoughts, and hopefully if you can bear with me, I will share that with you. Challenges and possibilities. I think that's what I wanted to end with. Challenges. I think a common challenge for us all is to try to explain why, of all possible matters and subjects, one should pay particular attention to Hong Kong. I think this is in Hong Kong, our colleagues in Hong Kong have to explain it in different ways. In the context of North America, we also have to explain, right? Of course, my colleague is not going to just walk up to me and ask, why are you doing Hong Kong? I mean, they're very polite. They don't ask that. But in the back of our mind, we need to provide some kind of explanation. I've been thinking about these questions for a long time, and I am not sure I have found a satisfactory answer. Why study Hong Kong? Now, of course, many of our colleagues have thought about it and probably have come up with a satisfactory answer. And sort of the three that I have sort of identified, and again, I may be missing some. So one, right, why study Hong Kong? One is that there's the uniqueness of Hong Kong. That Hong Kong is unique. Hong Kong is a historical oddity. And as such, it deserves to be understood and remembered. So one argument is that it's just a very unique place. Right? End of story. And then the second line of reasoning is that Hong Kong studies is the new Chinese studies. Now, this would, of course, not make any sense to people like me who study the history of imperial China. Right? But the argument is that the transformations of Hong Kong are in many ways a reflection of the transformations of China. So it is through study Hong Kong, through the study of Hong Kong, that we can get a better handle on the transformations of China. Maybe so. And then the third line of reasoning is that we should use Hong Kong as case studies, right? That is, we want to generate theories of knowledge based on Hong Kong as a case study, whether or not you're interested in protest, in democracy, in labor, in migration, you can, in investment, in whatever, you can use Hong Kong as a case study, and it can shed light on these larger movements and phenomena. I think it's a possible answer as well. And I don't think we need to necessarily exclude one from the other. I think these three operate, at least three, there are probably more, that at different times they can be deployed to answer that question. None of them is completely satisfactory to me by itself, but perhaps there's no satisfactory answer at the end. Finally, this is my final point, is possibilities, especially in the Canadian context. I think it might be useful to think about this book by Elizabeth Sin, our good friend, Pacific Crossing. Right? The book is about the migration, using Hong Kong as a hub of migration, both in and out. And of course, the bulk of the book is about migration, early migration through southern China, through Hong Kong to California. But in fact, we can think of this story as extending to Canada as well. That is, again, to go back to what makes Canada different from the US, is that this connection, starting from the late 19th century, the connection between Hong Kong and North America, the connection between Hong Kong and Canada, forged in the late 19th century because of a lot of laborers who went to California and then later on to BC to build our railroad. Some of them stayed, some of them returned back. That was one part of the story of the making of Canada. Of course, 2 days ago, or a few days ago, the Canadian Council in Hong Kong just commemorated the Canadian soldiers who sacrificed themselves during the Battle of Hong Kong, right, in 1941, December. So that is also another connection, important connection between Canada and Hong Kong. And then, of course, the third intersection, the third connection is, of course, the wave of migration, so the major wave of migration in the 1980s and 1990s, which brought hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers to Canada. Many of them have stayed. Some of them, many of them also have gone back to Hong Kong. So it is I think one of the point that I'm making then is this, that you think about, again, maybe it's making too much a case, but let's try to do it this way. Think about Hong Kong history is part of Canadian history, and Canadian history is part of Hong Kong history. Of course, some of my colleagues are going to object, but I think one can make a good case. And once you start thinking in that way, then perhaps answering the question, why study Hong Kong, is almost in reach. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to listening to other speakers. Thank you.
Okay, a big thank you to Leo. Fascinating sharing, and of course, looking at Hong Kong studies in Canada, we really see history in the making. There is going to be a huge surge in migration to Canada. We are looking at one such trend in Hong Kong, and certainly that we inject new energy into Hong Kong studies in Canada, and particularly we are intrigued by the observation Leo made about to understand Hong Kong is to understand China in the making. Certainly for those of us in Hong Kong studies long enough, in the 50s and 60s, when people couldn't go back to the mainland, they came to Hong Kong to do fieldwork in Hong Kong as a proxy for studying mainland China, especially in the new territories. There are a couple of villages around the EDU and the Chinese U. They were quite thoroughly researched as an example of a Chinese village in transformation, out migration and all that. I think that there are historical parallels as well, and certainly, but we are certainly looking at the history in the making of Hong Kong studies in Canada. Thank you very much, Leo. So we come to our third speaker of the day, Kuluta-san, Professor Toru Kulata-san, and who is the Associate Professor at Ryukyu University's College of Law and Politics in Japan, and he had his doctoral degree from the University of Tokyo's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and of course he has a lot of experience coming to Hong Kong, among which serving in the Japanese embassy in Hong Kong as one of their researchers, and of course he comes to Hong Kong almost several times a year, except this year, I guess, and has written quite extensively on the recent and developments in Hong Kong, including a recent book on Hong Kong after the handover to China. So we had a lot of sharings about what is happening in Japan, what is happening in Hong Kong. So, but today we will hear what he has to say about the development of Hong Kong studies in Japan in recent years. The time is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me share my PowerPoint. Can you see this? Okay, let me start. Hello, my name is Toru Kurata. I study Hong Kong politics at Rikyo University in Japan. Now I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all the members of the Academy of Hong Kong Studies, Education University of Hong Kong for inviting me to this annual conference. The title of my presentation is Past, Present, and Future of Hong Kong Studies in Japan. There is a long history of close exchanges between Japan and Hong Kong. There are many Japanese people and companies that carry out economic activities in Hong Kong, and there are more than 20,000 Japanese people living in Hong Kong. In addition, there are so many Japanese people who are interested in Hong Kong culture, such as movies and foods. For this reason, the number of books and papers on Hong Kong written in Japanese is considered to be the third largest after those written in English and Chinese. For many years, Japan has a relatively active tradition of Hong Kong study. However, the position of Hong Kong study in Japan is not so high. There are many researchers who are conducting research that includes Hong Kong as part of their research, but not many researchers call themselves Hong Kong study scholars. Hong Kong studies are either conducted as case studies in specialized fields such as political science, economics, history, or literature, or as part of broader area studies such as an Asian studies or Chinese studies. In other words, it is hard to say that Hong Kong study has been established as an independent research field in Japan. Today, I would like to briefly explain the history of Hong Kong study in Japan, then talk about the current state of Hong Kong study in Japan, and finally talk about the future prospects of Hong Kong study in Japan. There is a very long history of exchange between Japan and Hong Kong, and the situation in Hong Kong has attracted the attention of many people in Japan as well. Hiroaki Kani, a cultural anthropologist at Keio University and known for his research on water residents in Hong Kong, added a list of Japanese books and papers on Hong Kong as an appendix to his 1991 book, A Research on Hong Kong and Issues on Hong Kong. It contains 261 books and 1,174 magazine articles and academic research papers. The oldest of these is Ryokichi Kimura's translation of the Hong Kong section of British colonial policy in the East by French politician Joseph Charlie Burt, published in January 1898. Since then, numerous individual studies on various fields such as Hong Kong's commerce, finance, sanitation, and industry have been published in the 1910s by institutions such as the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce, the Government General of Taiwan, and the Bank of Korea. These studies were basically conducted by government-run institutions as a reference for Japanese colonial policy, and academic research was still scarce. The first book about Hong Kong written in Japan as a full-fledged scholarly book is The Opium War and Hong Kong by Jinichi Yano, a professor of Oriental History at Kyoto Imperial University. At that time, Yano was angry that despite the Opium War was an injustice act of violence that originated from the selfishness of Britain, there were no research by experts on this issue. So he published this book. However, ironically, only 2 years after the book was published in 1939, Japan invaded Hong Kong in turn. At that time, the findings of Hong Kong study conducted by the Japanese people living in Hong Kong were used for Japanese military operations. Even after the Second World War, Japanese interest in Hong Kong was mainly practical, and there are papers of fact-finding surveys on laws and economic trends. Since the 1960s, Hong Kong economy's takeoff attracted some scholars. In 1969, Shoichi Yokoyama published a study on Hong Kong's industrialization. In 1970, Susumu Kobayashi published Industrialization of Hong Kong. There were various intriguing arguments about the essence of Hong Kong in the achievement of such old Japanese Hong Kong studies. For example, in 1942, economist Hirokatsu Ogura's Hong Kong has this description: Hong Kong's history is probably one of the least distinctive. Hong Kong does not have Clive of India or Raffles of Singapore. After all, Hong Kong's governor's business is nothing more than a list of trivial things such as tax system, governmental organization, civil engineering projects, hygiene, and educational facilities, which has nothing to do with the world's history. This observation is already very close to the later studies of Hong Kong politics, a political nature. Fuminori Yamaguchi, a non-fiction writer closely observed Hong Kong society, wrote in his 1979 book, "The Hong Kongers are rarely referred to themselves as Hong Kongers. Most people just say Chinese." The issue of Hong Kong identity was a very interesting phenomenon for the Japanese at that time already. However, there were not many research achievements in Japan that really focused on Hong Kong itself. For example, the subtitle of Hiroaki Kani's Hong Kong Water Residents, published in 1970, is a profile of Chinese social history. It is clear that he chose Hong Kong as a place for fieldwork of Chinese cultural research. Needless to say, this was because it was difficult to conduct a field survey in China under the Communist Party administration at that time. In the 1980s, the relationship between China's reform and open door policy and Hong Kong's economic development attracted attention of Japanese people. And at the same time, Hong Kong movies became very popular in Japan. In addition, the handover issue was settled, and more people were interested in Hong Kong's future. This has increased the demand for an overall understanding of Hong Kong. From politics and economy to culture and history. In 1984, a book named I Want to Know More About Hong Kong was published by Hiroaki Kani. This book outlines various aspects of Hong Kong for the general public. Although the contents of the book may be just a common knowledge for Hong Kong people, this book was written by professional researchers and journalists from various fields who have specialized in Hong Kong. The publication of such books became possible because of the accumulation of many experts studying Hong Kong by then. Many of the books published during this period are the result of the researchers who have been studying Hong Kong for many years. Mineo Nakajima, who published a very thick research book entitled Hong Kong, A Transforming City-State in 1985, stayed in Hong Kong in 1969 as a research fellow of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From that time on, he conducted research in Hong Kong, leading to the publication of this book, which included a wide range of content on history and political economy. Nakajima is also a well-known scholar in Chinese politics and modern Chinese history in Japan. In Japan at that time, Chinese studies were mainly carried out by leftists. They had positive evaluations on the Cultural Revolution. However, Nakajima analyzed the Cultural Revolution as a power struggle by the leaders of CCP from an early stage, and this observation was highly evaluated later. Maybe his experience in Hong Kong has made it possible to objectively observe China without being influenced by its ideology. Since then, many of Japan's leading scholars on Chinese politics have experienced research in Hong Kong. The most well-known scholarly work on Hong Kong by Japanese is one written by Takeshi Hamashita. This map by Professor Hamashita is the most frequently quoted academic achievement of Hong Kong study by a Japanese scholar. Hamashita argues that through migration and accompanying monetary flow, Hong Kong is connecting huge hinterlands surrounds it, namely 1. Coastal China, 2. Pearl River Delta. Third, Southwest China. 4, continental Southeast Asia. 5, Indochina and Malay Peninsula. 6, South China Sea area. 7, Taiwan. And 8, Japan, Korea, Northeast China. He calls Hong Kong as a network city in Asia. Hong Kong people seem to like this map very much because in this map, Hong Kong is put at the center. Hong Kong is always described as being at the edge of British and Chinese empires, or on the southern peripheral of China, or a very small local polity. But in this map, Hong Kong, just a small point on this map of Asia, looks like a very big place, and this makes Hong Kong people and scholars studying Hong Kong like me feel very good. However, Professor Hamashita shows little interest in the inside of Hong Kong society in this book. Strictly speaking, this book is more of a study of the Hong Kong network than a study of Hong Kong itself. Although you can understand very well the connection between Hong Kong and the outside world through this book, it is difficult to know the uniqueness and characteristics of Hong Kong's politics, economy, society, culture, and so on. The major argument of this book was that Hong Kong was made up by connections with the outside world. This claim may be seen by the localist people today as they remote from Hong Kong society's reality. In the 1990s, when 1997 was approaching, interest in Hong Kong suddenly increased in both journalism and academia. Books about Hong Kong were placed in the most prominent places in bookstores. I was also the generation who wrote the graduation thesis of the university at that time, and at the time Hong Kong seemed to be positioned at the center of the world and the center of the interest of Japanese society. A study of Hong Kong and Hong Kong issues edited by Hiroaki Kani was published in 1991. The book was co-authored by 9 researchers and covers a very wide range of fields: 1967 riot, basic law, family affairs, street boys, district board elections, natives associations, languages, 19th century Chinese elite, and Hong Kong literature. At this time, Japan's interest in Hong Kong was focused on what would happen in Hong Kong under the one country's two systems. The transition from Britain to socialist China became an interesting research theme for researchers in all fields of Hong Kong. In Japan's Hong Kong study, the accumulation of research achievement is particularly abundant in the field of anthropology. Hong Kong has been used by cultural anthropologists as a field for Chinese studies. The research results were very interesting not only for China study but also for Hong Kong study. A book named Anthropological Analysis of Hong Kong Society, published in 1997, states that this book results from a panel entitled Contribution of Hong Kong Studies to Anthropology, held at the 1995 Joint Conference of the Japanese Society of Anthropology and the Japanese Society of Ethnology. This book has 3 parts: Rural Studies in the New Territories, Urban Social Studies in Hong Kong, and Ethnicity Studies in the International City. And it can be seen that Hong Kong has attracted attention as an interesting research subject for anthropology and sociology. Structural Changes in Colonial Hong Kong, edited by Yukari Sawada in 1997, was a collection of papers focusing on the fields of politics, economy, and society by various scholars. The book mentions not only the 1997 issue, but also many new themes on social transformation, such as Hong Kong's social welfare, public policy, and the formation of the middle class. After 1997, Japanese society rapidly lost interest in Hong Kong. It was argued that the handover went smoothly and that the one country, two systems was successful, which means nothing interest happened for news media. Information about Hong Kong became lesser and lesser in Japan. However, in the field of academism, Hong Kong study did not decline in Japan. After the handover, a large number of profound research books on Hong Kong study by a single researcher began to be published. Kazuhito Nakazono's 1998 book Sino-British Negotiations on the Status of Hong Kong, Noriko Hiroe's 2005 book A Study on Hong Kong Basic Law, Michiko Ai's 2009 book Hong Kong's Handover and Immigration Issues, my 2009 book Hong Kong After the Handover, Ryoichi Sasei's 2016 book Hong Kong, A Gateway in the Era of Empires, Akiko Kurata's 2014 book China's Modern Open Ports and Christianity, Tatsuya Koizumi's 2016 book Opium and Hong Kong were published after 1997. We can see that relatively young generation of researchers are conducting research in various fields of Hong Kong studies. The background to this new trend is the change in Japanese academic culture. In the past, many literary scholars did not have a PhD in Japan. After entering the doctoral program at the graduate school, it was common for them to drop out of the graduate school without writing a dissertation and continue to work as a researcher. However, since the 1990s, the internationalization of Japanese university has progressed, and the number of graduate schools issuing doctoral degrees has increased. In order to promote international exchange of scholars and to acquire international students, as a result, many graduate students enrolled in this doctoral program have begun to write long theses. Most of these books I have listed, including mine, are compilation of these dissertations. In addition to this, many studies have emerged that focus on Hong Kong itself rather than on external relationships of Hong Kong, such as Hong Kong Network. For example, the transition from Hong Kong seen in the readings and writings, edited by Masayuki Yoshikawa, a linguist who studies Cantonese language, is a study of the usage of Cantonese in the 1950s and 1970s. In this book, many scholars discusses Hong Kong society from various angles. With the 2014 Umbrella Movement and the large-scale protests in 2019, Japanese interest in Hong Kong increased again. Doctoral programs at the graduate school attracts a large number of students who are interested in Hong Kong's politics and society. A 2019 book entitled Hong Kong's Past, Present and Future was compiled from papers presented at an academic symposium held in my university, Rikyo University, to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, which includes such young researchers' works. Then, after the protests occurred last year, a book named A Deep Insight of the Hong Kong Crisis, which analyzed the causes of the crisis from many angles, was published in December last year by my research group. Currently, Japan's Hong Kong research has reached its biggest boom since 1997. Many academic societies are holding symposiums and events on Hong Kong issues, and the number of books on Hong Kong written by journalists is increasing significantly. Japan has accumulated achievements of Hong Kong studies in a very wide range of fields. Although there is no academic position in Japan, especially for researchers who specialize in Hong Kong study, there are currently at least dozens of researchers writing papers and books on Hong Kong. This is because Japan's Hong Kong studies have several strengths. First, Hong Kong studies have been applied in various forms to area studies such as Chinese studies, Asian studies, and British studies. In addition to providing knowledge for many existing academic fields such as political science, economics, history, etc. By conducting research that inspires other field scholars, researchers in Hong Kong study have been recognized and survived in academia. Second, such research is possible because Hong Kong can provide a lot of information for conducting empirical research. In Hong Kong, which is close to Japan, we can access easily to government statistics, official documents, university libraries, etc. and Hong Kong has free information and academic freedom. It is easy for Japanese scholars to conduct field studies and research activities in Hong Kong. Research in Hong Kong can be done in ways that are almost impossible in mainland China. Third, information about Hong Kong is published mainly in both English and Chinese, and there are many researchers in Japan who can read either or both. So many Japanese researchers can participate in Hong Kong study. On the other hand, there are also many problems in Hong Kong studies in Japan. As I have mentioned, researchers studying Hong Kong are active in various fields, which means they are dispersed. There are few specialized research institutes or organizations for Hong Kong study in Japan, and research is conducted in the form of individual research or projects of Japanese government scientific research grants. Many scholars identify themselves as scholars in academic fields such as political science and sociology or in Chinese and Asian studies. So exchanges of scholars in the field of Hong Kong studies are limited. Also, due to the ambiguity of Hong Kong's own identity, comparative studies are not easy to conduct. Should Hong Kong under the one country, two systems be compared to the state or the city? Unfortunately, in Asian studies and Chinese studies, the case of Hong Kong is often ignored or omitted as an exception. And because there are a few research platforms, especially for Hong Kong scholars, there is not enough space for young researchers to be instructed and to publish. For example, when a young scholar who study issues on Hong Kong write papers or make presentations at academic societies such as Chinese studies and Asian studies, many referees do not have sufficient knowledge about Hong Kong. So they have to spend long time or many pages to explain the basic knowledge on Hong Kong before entering into the main topics. And above all, I'm worried whether Hong Kong's free academic environment will be maintained in the future. Currently, Hong Kong study is overwhelmingly focused on areas related to Hong Kong's politics and society today. However, can research in such fields continue to be carried out freely in Hong Kong in the future? In particular, will there be any obstacles for Hong Kong researchers to collaborate with foreign countries such as Japan to conduct research on Hong Kong politics and society? Should academic research in Hong Kong become difficult, Japan should become a base for Hong Kong studies in Asia. Finally, I would like to introduce one of the latest achievements of Hong Kong study in Japan. A junior high school student in Nagoya was interested in high school students like her in Hong Kong protesting against the government and studied the history and politics of Hong Kong. Her grandmother mailed it to my university office to ask for my comments on the paper. As you can see, in Japan, a wide range of social interests are currently being directed to Hong Kong. As long as this situation exists, I think new Hong Kong study will continue to be conducted in Japan in the future. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kurata-san. And of course, some of the works that he mentioned in presentation brings back a lot of memory, especially those on Hong Kong's economic development, which I read as a graduate student in the 1980s. And certainly the recent interest, surge in interest on Hong Kong, I think is encouraging. And we really hope that with efforts like Kurata-san and others who is now focusing the Japanese society's attention on Hong Kong issues will help bring all this energy to greater fruition of research outputs. I still remember when I was a graduate student at Hong Kong U, I read some books written in Japanese in the 1920s and 30s. Very extensive research on Hong Kong society politics and also the military installations in Hong Kong. Very good maps of the batteries, the guns and cannons and all that. So you can see that in the 1930s they were planning something. Okay, so we'll thank you very much, and we'll move on to our next speaker and to the case of South Korea, and we have Professor Zhang Zhonga, Professor of the Chinese Language and Cultural Studies of Incheon National University, who was trained as a cultural anthropologist at the Seoul National University and had conducted extensive network on the Chinese mainland and also Hong Kong, and very recently, I think her research is very much in pulse and in sync with the talk of the town in Hong Kong now. We just had a big debate in Hong Kong social media about the significance of Sam Shui Po, right? And Professor Zhang's recent work was about Sam Shui Po as a wonderland, possible wonderland of cultural heritage, and I think that was a fascinating work. And she is also currently the director of the Institute for Chinese and Overseas Chinese Culture at the Incheon National University. So we'll hear from Professor Zhang about the recent development of Hong Kong studies in the areas that she's in. Okay, so Professor Zhang, the time is yours. Thank you.
So you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yes, and the
Yep.
share screen as well.
Yeah, okay. Yes, thank you. And I'm Jeong Zhang. I'm very honored and pleased to share with you the states of Hong Kong studies in Korea. And I'm very happy to meet professors, especially Roy Dialogue, again online. And I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I study both China and Hong Kong. I've been researching and doing field work in Hong Kong for many years. As you can see, the title of my presentation is Hong Kong Studies in Korea, focusing on the Korean views of Hong Kong. I think some of my points are rather overlapped with Professor Kurada, so I think I'm very pleased we can find some common points then on the basis of which we can discuss more. In my presentation, I will explore our research on and popular perceptions of Hong Kong in Korea. More specifically, I cover the following points: the gap between scholarly research and popular perceptions, and research fields and trends, and popular interest, and whether the 2019 demonstrations close the gap between scholarly research and popular perceptions or not, and Korean scholars' predicament, and continuing limitations or challenges and new possibilities, and moving towards cooperation, what we can do together. And first, Hong Kong research in Korea. Let me start with the major fields and trends. In general, as in Japan, Professor Kurada said, research fields in Korea regarding Hong Kong are neither very specified nor rich, to be frankly. For example, there are actually less than 5 Hong Kong specialists, including me. And meanwhile, most research on Hong Kong is related to mainland China and textually based. In fact, most scholarly articles on Hong Kong published in Korea are written by Chinese literature specialists, expanding focus on Hong Kong, examining text, literature, or films, etc. This means that most scholarly works on Hong Kong in Korea consist of literary translation, or literary criticism, or film analysis, etc. So, 임대근, 윤영도, 임춘성, 류영아, etc. And Asian studies specialists, there also are cases that they treat Hong Kong as part of Asia. For example, Hong Kong youth analyzed through film. In the field of history, there is some research on the relationship between Hong Kong and Chinese history. For example, the relationship with Canton and overseas Chinese enterprises, including Ha Sebong. And in the field of Chinese studies, research interests are emerging as extensions of Chinese studies research, social movements or labor movements, but not so many yet. And in the field of economics, there are almost no scholars focusing only on the Hong Kong economy, but Chinese economy experts study Hong Kong economy issues as they arise. Recently, research on the Hong Kong political system and social movements has emerged in the field of political science, area studies, and sociology. And so Kim Tae-gyun or Kim Jin-ho or like that. And there is an emerging interest in the relationship between Hong Kong social movements and Korean social movements. However, most studies still read Hong Kong as a case study with respect to institutions or activist movements. In this respect, maybe we could say that there is little scholarly interest in Hong Kong itself, as Professor Kurada also said about Japan's situation. To talk a little about my own research, I learned Cantonese and Mandarin for my fieldwork, which was related to the right of abode of men and children of Hong Kong, which was about the identity politics of Hong Kong. Until recently, I was actually almost the only one in Korea who did field work in Hong Kong speaking Cantonese, and now one more is added who explored the social enterprises in Hong Kong. And of course, there are some scholars who can speak Cantonese. I've also been researching the boundary making between China and Hong Kong, or community movement and urban citizenship, or collective memory, etc. Altogether, the Korean academic community focusing on Hong Kong itself is rather small, and we lack substantial basis for Hong Kong or Taiwanese studies. Now, let's look at how Korean media covers Hong Kong. In the Korean media, international news are not a substantial part of content. This is not just a matter of media companies or journalists, but maybe the limited demand from Korean society. In other words, domestic issues are overwhelmingly prioritized in Korea. For example, recent demonstrations in Thailand are not much covered or well known in Korea. So Korean journalists also struggle because it's very difficult to sustain audience for exploring international issues more in depth. Actually, there were some journalists who wrote series of excellent articles on Hong Kong. So Bang Min-hee, Gu Jung-eun, Lee Jae-ho, Kim Han-ju, like that. So in Korean media, news about Hong Kong and Taiwan are typically focused on issues regarding relations with mainland China or issues related to Korea. Let's move on to popular Korean interest in Hong Kong. Hong Kong popular culture had a significant impact on Korea beginning in the 1970s up until 1990s. This impact, besides the appeal of the Hong Kong popular culture itself, was also due to the fact that Koreans could feel a sense of kinship with Hong Kong as a part of an East Asian society. In any case, Hong Kong popular culture greatly influenced a generation of Korean movies, sensibilities, and collective memory. Even now, homage to past Hong Kong movies and actors appear in Korean movies and dramas and even in advertisements. So you can see some examples. The left one is a Korean film of this year titled Okay, Madame. The director said in an interview that it's an homage to Hong Kong film in 1986, Yes, Madame, which was very popular in Korea. And in 2004, there was a very popular Korean movie, 말죽거리 잔혹사. The whole film was an obvious homage to Bruce Lee, and it was really popular in Korea. And Zhao Yun-fat repeatedly appears everywhere still in Korea. So the famous image from the film of A Better Tomorrow too. And the middle one, the image is Korean advertisement, rather comic advertisement in 2014, and the Masked Singer show. This year, Zhao Yun-fat showed up. And we have almost every year, still we have Leslie Zhang, Zhang Guoguang, death anniversary every year. And there is a cafe and bar in Seoul named Chongqing Express, Chonghang Sangnam, which is named after the film. So the most important thing is that there is no need of explanation. Almost everybody knows the meaning of those images at a glance in Korea. So among Koreans, there is a prevalent image of Hong Kong as an international and sophisticated consumer city. Since the 1990s, Koreans' perception of Hong Kong has not moved this kind of rather simplified official discourse of consumer city and sophisticated and fascinating free city. There has been a gap between popular perceptions and academic research, which explored Hong Kong identity politics, etc. However, public was taken aback as 2019 movement unfolded. Then, have popular perceptions changed since 2019? Certainly, interest has increased in Hong Kong-China relations, Hong Kong's activist movement, and Hong Kong youth, and disparity between wealthy and poor. Especially, there has been an important shift in perception among Korean youth and social activists. First, interest and advocacy for Hong Kong demonstration has been increasing more among Korean young people, and such interest has broadened to include Hong Kong social problems and learning Cantonese. Second, some social activists began to advocate for and research and write about Hong Kong. So Sang-hyun, Hong Myung-kyo, Na-yeon-pil, Mi-ryu. In fact, Korean NGOs engaged in international solidarity movement have declared solidarity with Hong Kong demonstrations while also trying to stop the spread of anti-China sentiment that is very serious in Korea now. So this has been a quite tough work to do for the organizations to support Hong Kong demonstrations on one hand and try to stop the spread of anti-China sentiment on the other hand. Nonetheless, Koreans are faced with a predicament with regard to perceptions of Hong Kong. On one hand, Koreans have sympathized with the Hong Kong demonstrations, linking them with their own democratization movement. The demonstrations have surely aroused anti-China sentiment, especially among Korean young people. But most citizens sympathize with Hong Kong demonstration, not just because of anti-China sentiment, but more because the scenes of Hong Kong young people confronting police violence have evoked memories of the Korean democratic movement. On the other hand, the introduction of Hong Kong's national security law has led to a predicament. Koreans also have a national security law, despite having a democratic government. In that case, how should Koreans view Hong Kong national security law? Of course, it's different. Including me, many people are repeatedly emphasizing that the important thing is that what kind of government, what kind of society has and operates the law is very different. But this kind of rather complicated story cannot always be heard to everyone. So maybe we could say that Koreans have simply bracketed their perceptions in this regard. Meanwhile, the Korean government has been criticized for its relative silence regarding the Hong Kong demonstrations, and the critics said it was a strategic move to maintain good relations with China. On considering such circumstances, the 2019 movement has created both possibilities and limitations or challenges in Korea. Overall, many people are saddened by the events in Hong Kong, and many have written media articles about it. But ironically and sadly, interest is waning since passing of the national security law. COVID-19, which has naturally come to dominate public attention, is certainly also an important factor in this regard. Perhaps we can say that quite a lot of Koreans are not really interested in Hong Kong in and of itself, but in terms of their own past. In other words, most Koreans' interest in Hong Kong is limited to the linkage with Korea's proud history of democratization. Meanwhile, this interest has not broadened into a concern with democratization in Asia. Maybe this is the limitations of Korean society. And Korean scholars' predicament, we repeatedly emphasized through last year to this year movement that we should move beyond focus on whether Hong Kong is anti-China or not. We should move beyond emphasizing Korean proud achievement of democratization, viewing Hong Kong in terms of our past. However, our predicament is that most Koreans, even including the politicians, are still interested in Hong Kong in terms of anti-China issue. So discussions in media become simplified, focusing only on this dimension. Nonetheless, we should continue to emphasize that what is important is not, I am actually emphasizing repeatedly that what is important is not our past. We rather need to look at the new values and civil rights and the new kind of society the Hong Kong people are now creating. And considering this task of scholars, we can observe the intertwinement of reality and the topography of research. Koreans view Hong Kong is limited due to their own reality. Yes. So now, some criticize the Korean view of China and Hong Kong as characterized by state centrality. This has to do with the fact that the Korean views are caught up in the anti-China or pro-China dichotomy. So now, Korean cultural anthropologists, including me, are working on a book that 민간 중국 or civilian China or 만간 중국, which so this book is written in Korean. It is an attempt to view China in terms of lives of ethnic minorities or women workers on the basis of our own research or fieldwork. So we are trying to resist the state centrality of the Korean view. Now, how should we view Hong Kong? There has been much discussion regarding Hong Kong as method, so we can look to the work of Chen Guangxing or Chan Gun-jung or G.E.Y. or some in Korea, Liu Yong-ha. And there has also been much discussion and skepticism of the one country, two systems. And Brian Fong proposed to view Hong Kong as stateless nation, and other views, for example, Hong Kong as network, or the contradiction between the city and the state. And now, of course, the views are being more diversified. Then, can you find a possibility of new imaginaries and discourses about Hong Kong in Korea? I wrote a paper in Korean, the title of which can be translated as Hong Kong refuses to be an international city. What I mean by this is that Hong Kong is now refusing the given discourse of international city since 2014 umbrella movement, and I focused more on the community movement, etc., which has been playing a significant role throughout the movement from last year. And we can find another example in a conference hosted by the Academy of Chinese Studies of Incheon National University under the title of Korea and Greater China, where Professor Roy Dialogue participated as a speaker. I proposed the title at the time with the purpose of expanding the focus of Korean people to Greater China, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. We wanted to relativize the state and pursue a different perspective regarding China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. Finally, what tasks lie ahead for Korean scholars? Koreans tend to view Hong Kong in terms of Hong Kong-China relations or China-US relations. The basis for research on Hong Kong and Taiwan is weak in Korea. This is a problem not only just for Hong Kong and Taiwan research, but for almost all research areas regarding areas with little practical necessity in Korea. In Hong Kong, knowledge and understanding of Korea is increasing through Korean dramas or movies and novels. But in Korea, though we have good impressions and sense of familiarity with Hong Kong, but actual understanding is insufficient. Perhaps scholars, including me, should take the responsibility for this situation. This is the last PPT slide. Lastly, I will conclude my presentation by mentioning some future directions to explore together. We should probably acknowledge that establishing and maintaining a specialized Hong Kong Students Institute in Korea would be rather difficult at the moment in short terms. However, we can establish research and education platforms together through which we can learn and debate together. Also, we can create a research cluster, for example, involving the Institute for Chinese and Overseas Chinese Culture, International University, or Seonggong-Haedae Institute for Asian Studies, where Professor Roy Dialogue and Lo Weng-sang came for discussions a few years ago. Perhaps today's discussion can be a good starting point for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zhang, for the, again, very interesting overview of Korean views of Hong Kong. Certainly we have been living under the shadow of China long enough to know that a lot of people in the world look at Hong Kong through the lens of China or the relationship to China. And we are grateful for scholars like Professor Zhang in trying to develop kind of a perspective that places the subjectivity of Hong Kong in the center of their research. We certainly, at the Academy of Hong Kong Studies, will be very interested in pursuing further these kind of dialogues with your institutions in the future. So with this, we move on to our next discussion. We have our speaker, Dr. Philip Kading. I think he's around us. Is it? Yes. Dr. Kading is lecturer in international politics in the Department of Politics, and previously he also taught at the Hong Kong Baptist University, and before that, I think he finished his PhD in the Department of Government International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University in 2010, and also previously obtained his education in political science and Chinese studies at the University of Heidelberg, and also studied political science, film studies, and comparative literature at Hong Kong University, and learned Mandarin in Taiwan and probably Putonghua somewhere as well. So I guess he's now teaching in the UK, and believed Dr. Kading will be briefing us on what is going on in the UK about their research on Hong Kong and Hong Kong related matters. The time is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Morning in UK, so we
yes, yeah.
Appreciate the effort of getting and join us.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, the building was still closed, so I just was able to join you. I was a little bit worried that I couldn't get into my office. So thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation. I think this is a really meaningful event. I'm very honored to be part of this. So I'm trying to share my screen now. I have prepared a PowerPoint, and it should be this one. Let's see. Are you able to see this now? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yes, I want to just share a few ideas on the Hong Kong studies in the United Kingdom and Europe. Yeah, and the idea was to found the Hong Kong Studies Association as our institution as a supplement to the excellent work, of course, of the Academy of Hong Kong Studies and the Society for Hong Kong Studies. And I will just say a few words on this in the coming minutes. Okay, so who are we? Just very briefly. The conveners of the Hong Kong Studies Association are, aside from myself, Dr. Heidi Wong Kading, who's a lecturer in international relations at Keele University, also in the UK, and Mr. Gray Sargent, who has a master's in Chinese studies from SOA, studied Mandarin as well in Taiwan recently, and is now a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. So to tell you a little bit about the context of Hong Kong studies in the United Kingdom and Europe. You remember that internationally, Hong Kong, unfortunately, was not a very hot topic for research after 1997. So I think a lot of academics in the West thought that with 1997, the Hong Kong situation or the Hong Kong question was settled, so to speak, and there was very little research going on. So I did my exchange, as you mentioned, at Hong Kong U in the early 2000s, and I was really fascinated by Hong Kong politics. So I did an excellent lecture there, Professor Sunny Low, and it was really engaging how he talked about Hong Kong politics. I'd never studied this before, and then I thought, okay, well, that's the thing I want to do now for the rest of my life. And I went back to Heidelberg, and then I was told by a very prominent professor, say, well, your year in Hong Kong was completely wasted because you didn't learn Mandarin. And I was a little bit disappointed, of course, but I still went on and did my magister, so like an MPhil master at Heidelberg. But when I thought about doing a PhD, I encountered the same issue, that there was not a lot of research done by academics in Germany and Europe when I looked wider, and therefore decided to come to Hong Kong and do the PhD there. And this, of course, it was a wonderful time. When I came to the UK for my job here, I was thinking, well, maybe we can have some kind of a community to meet, exchange our ideas about Hong Kong. Hong Kong was changing at the time already politically. The post 80s at the time, you remember, that was quite important. I think setting the seeds for all the movements coming later. But again, in terms of political science and international relations, very little we could find there. And Chris Hughes from the LSE told me that was probably the only one in the UK actively working on and researching on Hong Kong politics, was what a little bit disappointing and also surprising after we have so much linkage between the UK and Hong Kong. But I think things changed relatively quickly, and this is really thanks to the LSE Taiwan research projects led by Shifan Long. And she, in 2013, launched a seminar series called Taiwan and Hong Kong in a Comparative Perspective. They did this comparative perspective with Taiwan before, and now they zoomed in on Hong Kong. So in Taiwan at the time, there was already the awareness that we have to look at Hong Kong politics more closely. And at this seminar series, we had very eminent scholars, Edward Vickers, Paul Morris, whom I think you all know very well, and Carol Jones, with decades and decades of experience in Hong Kong, also institutional experience. So it's really nice to get to know these people, bring them together, and think about moving forward. Can we do something together? Then things in Hong Kong itself politically started to change quite dramatically with the umbrella movement, and we had a lot of events organized by students in 2014 already. And again, we were able to meet fellow academics who were researching on Hong Kong, were interested in Hong Kong, and I just highlighted two of them here, two of these activities. The one at York, then organized by Shirley Kung, who's now an excellent scholar in social work at Durham herself. Another way forward to institutionalization is, of course, the Hong Kong History Project, which has really made a huge impact on Hong Kong studies in the UK and Europe, and it's still ongoing since 2015, so for 5 years. Professor Bickers said they have 7 studentships, and 3 of the scholars who started have their PhD, have now found work in Macau, for example, at Hong Kong BU. So it's really a very important project for Hong Kong studies in the UK. And after this, we observed more changes in Hong Kong, of course, and became increasingly concerned with what was going on in terms of, for example, the usage of the some of the colonial laws, like the Public Order Ordinance. And this led to a seminar and an event at the Parliament organized by the Henry Jackson Society and the University of Surrey on the 20th anniversary of the Hong Kong handover. So we really saw a big change to 10 years before, where there was hardly any activities in Europe at the time to think about Hong Kong. 10 years, but 20 years after the handover, I think there was a realization now in Germany, in France, and especially in the UK, that Hong Kong has to be observed. So this was one of the first events, and just one day later, we had a really important event at the University of Birmingham, organized by Carol Jones, bringing together for the first time 15 to 20 scholars, PhD students, master students working on Hong Kong in the UK to think about what we can do further to institutionalize these linkages, to have more exchanges. And at the end of 2017, an NGO, a charity for human rights, observing human rights in Hong Kong, Hong Kong Watch, was founded, and they had several events also inviting scholars. So we went along, and it was quite interesting, these events, but we felt we need more of an academic perspective there. And therefore, we try to combine these raising awareness on what's going on in Hong Kong and in the political realm and legal aspects with also a more scholarly approach. And this is where we came to the EU Parliament event, which made a huge impact at the time, I think. So this was hosted by an academic himself, and also a member of the European Parliament, Professor Josef Weidenholzer, and co-introduced by Joe Lyon from the European Parliament China delegation. And we brought together then academics. So you can see here academics from Hong Kong, of course, Benny Tai, Joseph Lien, Carol Jones, again, and Tim Pringles, and Heidi Wang Kading. So we had a very nice talk, had a lot of MPs, European Parliament members joining, and I think that really pushed us further to institutionalize and these type of exchanges. So we thought, okay, we need to create a Hong Kong Studies Association, or some kind of institutional home. Yeah? At the same time, the Hong Kong Studies Association, and so the Society for Hong Kong Studies, the Academy for Hong Kong Studies, made these phenomenal advancement for the study of Hong Kong globally, but more focus on Hong Kong itself, physically, and United States or North America. So we thought maybe we can complement this a little bit with something in the UK, targeting UK, but also European scholars to bring another area globally into the study. And we were encouraged very much by the European Association for Taiwan Studies to move forward with this, to have been very good friends all the way, because they became very interested in this comparative perspective between Taiwan and Hong Kong. So the first thing we did was really contact key academics in the field to create an advisory board, giving us advice on how we set up this organization. And here we have Robert Bickers from the Hong Kong History Project, whom I mentioned already. So really one of the key figures. Carol Jones from Birmingham, there below, focusing on law in Hong Kong, and then Eva Pils from King's, also with a law perspective, and also again international and human rights perspective, and then finally Tim Pringle from development studies at SOAS. So these are scholars who have worked on Hong Kong for many decades, lived often in Hong Kong for many years, and they were able to advise us on how to move forward. And what we really want to do is provide a platform to share and promote and facilitate individual and collaborative research on Hong Kong, in Europe, in the UK, and foster this community of working on Hong Kong across European universities and other research institutions. And we want, of course, to promote publications on topics related to Hong Kong in all different disciplines. We're really interdisciplinary and go beyond social sciences or humanities and include everybody who wants to participate, is interested in Hong Kong studies. And one of our key challenges is really to try to locate Hong Kong in the disciplines. And this is, I think, something we have all been struggling to getting work published in, for example, political science journals or international relations journals focusing on Hong Kong. Is really tough because it's always, why don't you go to an area studies journal? And but I think Hong Kong, its relation to the world, its relations to China, its internal dynamics has so much to say for all kinds of different academic disciplines. So that's really our aim, to push forwards disciplinary research in Hong Kong. So getting published in disciplinary journals. So what we are doing is actually, what we did was really only, first of all, create a website. So we all volunteers. There's no membership fee or something. So we do this in our free time, as we all do for these institutions. And this is, I think, we all have in common at the academy, the society, and we created the website, and we were very fortunate that we got help of Kayla Wong, who describes herself as a passionate about the future and well-being of Hong Kong graphic designer based in Hong Kong, and she created this very nice logo and says that these tiny little squares of Hong Kong with different shades of green give this a bold, dynamic, but also a serious tone, and try to symbolize the collaboration among scholars in Hong Kong and across the world, and the uniqueness of Hong Kong. So this is really our vision, work together, but also highlight the uniqueness of Hong Kong in all different aspects. So aside from our website, I will say a few words later about our blog and also other initiatives. But when we started, we were around 100 academics. So we have to thank a graduate student from Hong Kong. Unfortunately, now because of national security law and all these, he doesn't want to be named anymore, which is really a testament to the big changes we have been encountering in studying Hong Kong over the last couple of years. But he went through all the academic institutions in the UK and beyond to find out who actually published something on Hong Kong. And then we contacted all of them individually saying, okay, we are now setting up this organization. Do you want to join? And a lot of people said, yes, of course, we're very interested. It's a very important time. So we moved forward in 2018 and then finally established the Hong Kong Studies Association in 2019, summer 2019. At a very important time, of course, in Hong Kong history. And you can see that around a third of our members are postgraduate students, and 2/3 are academics with permanent position. At the moment, at the beginning, we had around 1/3 of members female and 2/3 male. We have now, within 1 year, doubled our membership to around 200 and have now increased the female ratio, so moving more towards gender parity and balance to around 42-43%. So hopefully we can push this further, I think, but it's quite encouraging. In terms of our membership, as I said, we are based in the UK. We used the UK database in the beginning. Therefore, most of our members are in the UK. This is from the initial grouping, so around 100 colleagues, most of them in the UK, but also Germany. Then we a little bit sneaky, we put out Scotland separately there to get a little bit of variety. But you can see a few colleagues from Hong Kong already, and other European places. As I said, we doubled the numbers now and have more academics from other European countries, from Germany, Switzerland, France, Austria, but also much more colleagues now from Hong Kong and Taiwan joining. As I said, our focus is really on the UK and Europe, because we don't want to double the efforts from the Society of Hong Kong Studies and the Academy of Hong Kong Studies with their excellent work in incorporating colleagues from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and North America. But anybody who wants to join can join us, of course. As I said, there's no membership fee. And what we can offer is, I think our key element is our blog. So this is called Hong Kong Insights, where we want to showcase latest research by academics working on Hong Kong. So here they can have the latest papers, a book or an article, conference paper, summarized in a very accessible way. And then we publish every month one of these blog posts. So it's not an opinion piece, but really showcasing different types of research on Hong Kong. So you can, if you become a member of the Hong Kong Studies Association, you get a monthly update, a newsletter saying, okay, these are the events, academic talks going on in the UK. Now, virtually we include, of course, also from abroad. And then please have a look at our blog posts, so you can get a feel for the exciting research which is going on in Hong Kong studies. And we had our launch event, a seminar last autumn at King's College, and here we invited very important academics like Tim Pringle, for example, Shirley Kung, but also Eric Lai, and with the activist element, of course, Eric Lai himself, and also Billy Fong. And this is something I think we learned from other events, which are quite prominent during last year during the anti-extradition movement protest. So you had either events who were more focused on the advocacy side of things or really purely academic, and we try to combine this a little bit. So I have a little bit of an activist element, a frontline activist element with Billy here, but then also pushing the envelope in terms of research on the movement as far as possible. So because it's a really informed audience, there's no overview of what's happening in Hong Kong. We all know what's happening, but how can we analyze this? How can we understand this? How can we move forward with this? So Tim Pringle pushing here ideas, for example, of labor unions and the work of labor unions in this, talking about strikes when nobody was really thinking about this at the time very seriously. Shirley Kung, and really pushing her really meaningful